Hi there. In this video, we'll try to understand DML operations. DML stands for data manipulation language, which consists of four different commands. One is insert, second one is update, third statement is delete, and the fourth one is merge operation, right? So insert command is used to insert the data into the table. Update is used to update the data in the table, and then delete is to delete the data from the table, and then merge is to execute all three commands or any one command or any two commands together. Like, if we want to insert and update the data, or update and delete the data, or insert and delete the data, something like that, we can make use of it, right? So let's check it out right now. So let's assume that, I don't have a customers table and I want to create a new table. So drop table and then customers. Now I'm going to create a new table, and if you look at the first column, I have purposefully given it as like customer ID, and it is always going to be populated using identity column and sorry, identity feature, which is nothing but like a kind of unique key that always gets generated. And then I'm saying that it's a primary key column. That means that it cannot take either null value or it cannot take any duplicate value. And then I have customer name. Customer name is a variable character 2 with 100 characters length. It can take up to. And then email ID column, which is like, again, variable character 2 data type with 100 characters length. And then we have date of birth, which is date, and then create date time, which is also date parameter. And if you look at create date time, I made it as by default system date, right? So why do we have default system date? That means that if I don't insert any value for created date time, by default it is going to sys date, which is nothing but the time whenever we have executed a statement, insert statement, whatever the time it gets executed, the same time will be inserted as a date into the created date time field, right? So first let's check if there is any data, and there is no data, sorry, and there is no data right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert the data for 5 columns first place, right? So what I will do is I'll just remove this. And so if I just run it now, we're getting an error, right? Cannot insert into generated always identity column. What it is saying is I'm trying to insert the data into the customer ID with value as 10, but this column was made as generated always as identity. So it is going to generate the sequence values, and for such kind of columns, we cannot insert the data. That's the error, right? So what I'll do now is I'll just comment it out, and then I'll try to insert the data for only 4 columns and then see what happens now. And if you look at now, we are getting the not enough values. That's because the table has 5 columns, but we are only passing the 4 column values, right? So obviously it will throw an error. Then how do we insert the data? If we try to insert the data for customer ID, it is throwing an error that, for identity column, we cannot pass the value. If you don't pass the value for customer ID, then it says that not enough values. So in these kind of situations, we can specify the column names explicitly, right? So in this case, I'll say that customer name and then email ID, and then I'll say date of birth and then create date time, right? So this is how I'll specify. So what the SQL will expect now is like I'm trying to insert the data into 4 columns, and how many arguments I'm passing? I'm passing 4 arguments. So for 4 columns, 4 arguments I'm passing, and let's try to execute it. And if you see now, it has been executed successfully. So one thing what we have to notice here is for customer name, I'm giving the Venkat name as Venkat and email ID I gave it as venkat at mail.com, and then date of birth I kept it as sysdate, and create date time is also like I'm passing the variable which is sysdate, which is a system variable, and it will always give us the time whenever this statement gets executed. Right? It has been inserted. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert another customer data in the same way. So here what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to insert the data into customers once again, and I'm specifying all the attributes as well. But one thing, if you notice, here in the first place I have the customer name, but the value what I'm passing is like mail ID, and second column is email ID, but I'm passing the sysdate. And because email ID is variable character true, sysdate can be taken. And the third column is like date of birth. Here I'm saying that means that whatever the third argument I'm passing, that will be taken as date of birth. And fourth argument is created date time when this row is getting created in the database, but for that I'm giving it as ram. So in this case, for customer name, because the data type matches, it will be inserted, and email ID again it will be accepted because they both are date parameters. Date of birth again it is going to be accepted because they both are date. And Create date time will expect to pass the date value. However, I'm passing the string and it will throw an error, right? Let's look at it. Okay, so we have to be cautious. Sometimes, even if the value gets accepted, it doesn't mean that the value what you have inserted is appropriate. In this case, the best example is like for customer name, we are passing the ram@mail.com, but this is not actually customer name. This should be going under email ID. So, which means that the sequence of columns that we specify here while inserting into, it doesn't matter whether they are in the same order here or not while creating the table, but they should be matching with the order the data is being passed. Or at least you can specify the columns in the same sequence as of the table, but the values have to be passed in the same order, right? In case if the order mismatches, then obviously, as we can look at here, like it is saying that non-numeric characters was found where numeric was expected. That's nothing but create date time it in some month format or date format, but whereas we are passing a string which is not in valid date format, and obviously it will throw an error, right? So the position of the column versus the values at what position we are passing should always be matching. Sometimes even if they do not match, but if their data type matches, then the statement gets executed successfully without throwing any error. But when we really look at the data, then we'll end up seeing that like there is an issue that the value is supposed to be inserted into one column, but it has been inserted into a different column. And then there is another way, like again, I'm using the table from dual. So earlier, like we looked at how to insert the data for all the columns where we were getting the error, and then we changed it to like inserting the data for the limited columns, and it worked it out. And then I'm also inserting the data into the table, but this time by selecting columns, by selecting the values from a dummy table, right? Sometimes what happens is like when we want to insert, instead of passing the values part of the insert statement, in case if you want to get the data really from some other table, then we may end up using select statements. And another classic example when we will be doing something like this is insert into customers. I'll specify the customer name, right? Customer, and I'll specify the mail ID, but I'm not going to specify the date and create date of birth because I'll specify the TOB, but I do not specify the create date time. And now this is like Jimmy, and then I'll concatenate level, comma, Jimmy, concat level at mail.com, and then I want to pass date of birth, which is going to be sysdate from dual connect by level less than 100. So if we just run this, now we can see that the value of Jimmy, it has incremented by a sequence number. This is something I wantedly generated, and let's give it as an alias name, right? So here what I'll do is I'll say that this is cust name, which is nothing but customer name, and here I'll say that email ID, and here I'll say that this is date of birth, right? If we select now we can see it appropriately with proper naming convention, right? So now we have all these values. So think of that, in this case, like dual is a dummy table which we are leveraging for now to generate more values. But in real life example, when you start working on the database, sometimes you may have to select the data from one table and you may have to insert the data into the table. Then in that case, like this is how you're going to pass all the columns. Like in case if you have the customer name, email ID, and date of birth as it is in the source table, then you're going to select all those columns in the select, and then from whatever the table you're going to select, right? I'll talk more about what is level function and all. It's something called as hierarchical function. I'll have a separate session talking about it, as there are several features. But for now, that like level is something a hierarchical function which can generate how to return. And in this case, I'm returning almost 100 rows, 99 rows, right? And I'm going to insert the data. So I'm not inserting the data for two different columns. The first one is customer ID, and as we know, like it is something identity column, and the second column is like created date time, and by default it is going to be inserted with the sys date whenever the statement gets executed, right? Whenever I say that like the statement gets executed, now for example in this case, if I run this statement, whatever the time it is, it will leverage the same time to insert into the created data, right? It is, and we can see that now 19 rows have been inserted, right? So this is another way of inserting the data into specific set of columns, and let's commit it, and then let's, and if we select now, we can see that we have so many rows in the table and we are able to select it. Now what if I want to update the customer name with relevant customer ID? Instead of giving some random numbers, I would like to suffix the customer ID at the end of the customer name. This is nothing but like updating the data. So to update the data, what we have to do is like the syntax is update, and then what is the table name? I want to update customers, right? So update customers, I'm not going to specify update table customer name, customers. I'm saying that update what is the actual table name customers, and then set, I'm trying to set the value. What values are we trying to set? Customer underscore name, customer name equal to, with what value do we want to set it? In this case, I want to set it with customer name concatenation. I'll talk about this later on concatenation. And for now, double pipe symbol is nothing but like concatenation, and I'm going to say that cust underscore id, right? And so what it will do is like customer name and customer id is going to be concatenated, and then it will update across the table. So now we can see that it has updated 101 rows. Once again, let's select the data from customers, and we can see that now, like for Venkat it's 1, for John it's 2, for Jimmy it is 1 4, because earlier it was having Jimmy 1, and now it is like 4 is also added, so it is like Jimmy 1 and 1 4, right? Likewise, we can see that all the values have been generated successfully. So this is how we can update the data. In fact, we can update there is no numeric value at the end, but for that we'll have the regular expressions or more or some other way of finding it out if there is any number and all, which we'll discuss in some other session, right? What I want to do is other way. I'll just roll back this, what are the changes I have done just now, and then let's select the data once again, and we can see that it is actually auto committed this particular yeah. All right. Now whatever the customer name is there, uh, sorry, now I have email ID. I would like to change this email address based on the customer name. So how do I update it? And I want to do it only when the email ID is not like starting with Jimmy, right? How do I do this? So what I can do is update customers set equal to, and then I'll say that customer underscore name concatenated in the rate. Yeah, it is already there. Okay, at mail.com, right? And here we cannot give the alias name as alias name. The reason is like we're setting the value, we are not trying to select the value. As keyword can only be used to give the alias name when we are selecting the data, but not while updating the data, or not while deleting the data, right? So here what I'm saying is like anyway the customer name is not starting with Jimmy, right? For all those customers, update by id for prefixing the customer name, right? So let's do this now, and I see that there are only 2 rows that are updated. And now if I go back and query the table, we can see that venkat1 at mail.com and john2 at mail.com. Earlier it was like venkat at mail.com and john at mail.com. Now it is changed to venkat1 at mail.com and john at mail.com. So this is how like 2 rows. Likewise, we can actually apply the equal filter. Let's say that wherever the customer ID is 1, there only we want to update it. Then we can do it once again. So update customers, um, dob sysdate. What I'll do is add underscore months of sysdate, comma 200 months, just for an example, where customer underscore ID equal to 1. So in this case, wherever the row is customer ID 1 for the particular customer, Set the date of birth as going back to minus 200 months. Minus 200. So each year is like 12 months. Likewise, for 10 years, it's going to be 120 months. Likewise, you can calculate it. So those many years, we are resetting back the date of birth. So if we just run it, now we can see that only one row has been updated instead of two rows. And if we go back and select the data, we can see that now 2008, right, which is like almost 16 years, we went back, right? So this is it for a given row, or this is how we can update for a set of rows based on some data searches and all. And earlier we looked at another way of doing it where we did not give any. That means entire data in that particular table is going to be updated, right? So now let's look at deleting the data. So let's say I want to delete all the data births, because now this is inaccurate, and I right. So always remember that we cannot delete the data from a specific column. We can only delete the row, but we cannot delete the column value. We can drop a column if we want, but we cannot delete the data of a column from a table. Instead, what we'll have to do is update customers set DOB equal to null. So now if I run this, that means that entire data birth column is going to be updated with null value. The moment that means that is exist in the data birth, it. This is nothing but equal to deleting the data from the data birth column. But however, remember that it is not an actual deletion. We just updated all the data birth column value to null value, right? However, when it comes to delete, we can only delete the row. For example, delete from customers set sorry customers where I want to delete customer ID equal to 1. So this means that wherever the customer ID is 1, delete that particular row, not any specific column value. We are just saying delete from. Or there are people who will also specify delete star. Either you specify delete from or delete star from. It's going to be same, right? Let's look at it. I think SQL developer was throwing error. However, now we can see that one row has been deleted. And then if we go back and query the customers table, we can see that Venkat is no longer existing in this particular row, right? How about now I want to delete all the rows where uh, customer name starting with Jimmy, right? How do I delete it? So delete from customers where customer underscore name like, and I'll say Jimmy percentile, right? So now what it will do is any customer name which is starting with Jimmy followed by whatever the number can be, all those customers data we want to. It's not like we are trying to delete the data from a specific column. Instead, we are trying to delete all the rows, right? If I just run it now, we can see that 99 rows have been deleted. If I go back and then query the customers table once again, we can see that there is only one column, and it is possible that we can delete all the data from the table at a time. It's like delete from customers. The moment we do this, so what it does is it deletes entire data from the table because we did not specify any specific where condition. Even if we have really 101 rows, all 101 rows would have been deleted. And in case if we want to run a delete statement without any where condition, which is nothing but deleting the entire data from the table, what we can do is we can run actually truncate table customers. So this is another alternative approach to the delete operation when we want to delete entire data from a table. However, please note that truncated is a DDL operation, whereas delete is from operation. So what I will make the difference. So you can go back and check. There is one base that is like when you perform the truncate operation, entire data from all the blocks that are associated to the table are wiped, and it's really fast, and it's a declaration, which means that automatically the data gets removed, and you don't need to explicitly commit. And also when you perform the truncate operation, the memory can be released back into the pool so that some other can really reuse it, and that's called as like reducing the high water mark. If you perform delete operation, though you have deleted the data statistics, that means that your table will assume that all the blocks associated with the table will be having the data, and whenever you try to select the data from the table, in case if it is not doing an index scan, then it will try to scan all the empty blocks, and that's a waste of time, right? So other thing is like whenever we perform any DML operation, do remember that there is something called as redo log and a dirty buffers, which means that whenever you perform any operation like DML operations, especially insert, update, delete, and merge operation, that means you're modifying the data. Whenever you modify the data, before it starts writing the changes into the block, whatever the current state of the record that exists in the database in the block, coded and stored into the buffer, I mean dirty buffers, and the same row will also be returned into the archive log files, which is nothing but redo logs, so that in case if the transaction is not successful or we do not want to have the data, instead we wanted to go back to the previous state instead of latest data, then we can perform the rollback operation. And whenever we perform the rollback operation, whatever the data we have in the dirty buffers, the same rows are going to be put back into the table, and then no data will be returned into the redo logs as well, right? So all of this can only happen when you perform the delete operation or insert operation or update operation. However, when you perform the truncate operation, though this is wiping out all the data from all the blocks, it still doesn't track and write the dirty buffers the redo log files, because when the data is truncated, we are not deleting row by row operation, so it cannot be captured. Next thing is, whenever you perform any DML operations, let's say that if there is an index, the index is going to be refreshed, and if the partition, then sorry, whenever you are truncating a table, if there is any index, entire index will be wiped out. Whereas in case if you delete the data from a table, then the index will have to be refreshed to get to know the latest stats, what data exists, where exactly it exists. That is another thing. And truncate doesn't run any trigger on a table. You have some sort of trigger, which is like whenever there is a change in the data, it wants to capture and put into another table. So in case if you run the truncate operation, then the trigger is not going to get to know how many rows are impacted, because it is not performed row by row operation. Whereas in if you run the insert operation, delete operation, then it is going to perform row by row operation. That means that each and every row that gets inserted or updated or deleted, that can be captured by the trigger and then put into another table. So that means like you know exactly what data has changed, right? So these are some differences between truncate and delete operation. And remember that truncate works very well when it comes to quickly wiping out all the data from a table, and then it also has like whether we want to the space or we want to release the space from the segments that are associated to the table or not, right? So this is all about different DML options we will try and delete, and how to insert the data, what error do we get data into an identity column, and then what if I mean like how to specify what order the columns have to be present while inserting the data, and what happens if you don't specify the column names. Instead you just try to provide the column values without the header, which means that like if there are less number of rows, it is throwing error that not enough values, and if there are more number of values that are being passed, we'll get an error, right? So that's about for this video, and in our next video we'll talk about merge operation, when do we need to go with merge, and what are some performance implications. Till then, have a good day. Bye bye.